Sorry Now, Paul Turner Mystery, Book 1. Author Mark Richard Zubro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York, 1991. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 3. Paul Turner pulled into his driveway just before 8. He walked 2 doors down, Carpenter Street, to Gino's Grocery on the corner. Sometimes strollers filled the sidewalks outside the Italian lemon ice stand. People waited in lines, 4 and 5 deep. In Gino's, he nodded hello to Marco behind the counter and loosened his tie as he waited his turn. He ordered a meatball submarine sandwich with extra hot Italian peppers and a large salad. Marco asked after Jeff and Brian. Marco's wife, Maria, gave him a small carton. Paul knew she'd filled it with Italian ice cream. For Jeffy. He gets around so well. Paul thanked them and walked around the corner to the house between his and the grocery. Mrs. Rose Tolucci lived on the ground floor by herself. Paul loved Rose. She cared for Jeff every day after school, whenever Paul or Brian couldn't be home, and often wound up giving the boys and their dad dinner. And this was prearranged on a weekly basis. For several years after it started, she refused all offers of payment. Being neighbors and nearly family precluded even discussing such things. But one day Mrs. Tolucci couldn't fix a broken porch. Paul had offered, and since then he'd done all repairs and had even done several major renovations. On the second floor of the home lived Mrs. Tolucci's 2 daughters and several distant female cousins. At 91, Mrs. Tolucci ruled this brood, her main concern being to keep them out of her way and to stay independent. Numerous times she'd confided in Paul that if they weren't family, she'd throw them all out. She did her own cooking, cleaning, and shopping, as she had for 73 years. To her daughter's horror, she took the bus on her own throughout the city and even to suburbs to visit friends, relatives, shopping center openings, or anything else that struck her fancy as something new and interesting. She looked up from her copy of Hegel's Reason and History and greeted Paul with a friendly nod. Paul gave Jeff a hug and set the ice cream in front of him. Seeing the carton, Mrs. Tolucci said, "That woman is going to spoil the boy." Jeff said, "Look at my papers, Dad." Every Friday, Jeff's teacher put all his work together from the week and sent it home with a progress report for each subject. Paul pulled a chair over and sat next to his son, and they went through each paper, the boy smiling at the many successes, Paul praising him for doing so well or listening to explanations of the few mistakes, making sure his son had understood what he might have done wrong. Mrs. Tolucci stood behind them, leaning against the sink. She saw how the boy leaned against his father, how Paul Turner's arm wrapped around his son's shoulder. She smiled. Such a good father with such nice boys. She crossed herself and prayed for such goodness to continue. When they finished, Jeff swung himself to the counter and grabbed a spoon and sat back down. Paul picked up her book and noted the title and said, "I thought you already had your degree in philosophy." Casting around for things to do after her husband died, Mrs. Tolucci had begun taking courses at the nearby University of Illinois campus. In the past 20 years, she'd graduated magna cum laude from 3 different universities, accumulating 1 bachelor's and 2 master's degree. She nodded at the book in Paul's hand. "It's for a course down at the University of Chicago. I wanted to brush up a little." Paul smiled and said, "I have to go out tonight. Can you watch Jeff?" "I always tell you to go out more. You need to meet someone your own age. You need to be in love. Then you'll be happy." They'd had this discussion often before. He said, "I have the boys to look after and my job." She interrupted. "No more about the job. You need somebody." "Marriage," he began. "Who said anything about marriage? I know marriage from 50 years with the same man. It was good enough. Now I take care of myself. But for a while, you need somebody." Jeff grabbed his crutches and pivoted around the kitchen table and into the living room. Paul heard him turn on the CD player Mrs. Tolucci had bought herself as a Christmas present last year. The boy turned on muted music. Paul knew he would later find him curled up with a book. Mrs. Tolucci refilled Paul's glass of lemonade from a plastic container in the refrigerator. She put it in front of him. "I know who you should meet." Paul held up a hand to protest. Please. He's a nice boy. Ben Vargas, at the garage. The same age as you. A good Italian boy. No paunch and no gray hair. Never been married, and Mrs. Pauley thinks he might be, you know. Paul wasn't sure. He was always used to Mrs. Tolucci being so open about his sexuality. He never told her, but she seemed to know people's secrets before they did. She'd disliked his wife and never made a secret of her feeling that Gale'd been an outsider and not right for him. She'd been trying to fix him up with likely bachelors for years. She walked over to him, smiling. She moved a chair closer to him at the table, sat down, and patted his arm. I saw the TV news. That crazy preacher lost his beautiful daughter. She crossed herself. I knew you'd be late. They always give you the tough cases. You work too hard. She placed her wrinkled old hand on his face. You're such a good father. You take care of the boys better than any two parents. Go out tonight. Enjoy yourself. He nodded. I'm a little worried about Brian going to some party tonight. She smiled. No need. The party is all innocence. Brian came by earlier. I gave him supper. He can make his own, Paul protested. He didn't ask her how she knew about the party and that it would be okay for his son to be there. She would know by her secret ways, and she would be right. He hurried next door and changed into faded jeans and a black t-shirt. He heard the water running. Brian undoubtedly taken another shower. Must want to make a serious impression on some girl, Paul thought. He used the bathroom off his own bedroom to brush his teeth and comb his hair. On his way out, he rapped on the door of the bathroom his son used. Brian opened it. Steam rushed out, and his son stood there, a towel clutched around his waist. Don't be late, Paul told him. We've got to be up early to get the chores done, so we can work on your car. No problem, Dad. Maybe we'll have to go to Ben's for an auto part. That is not why I want to fix the car. You want to use it, you've got to help fix it and pay for it. Brian smiled knowingly. Turner said, Between you and Mrs. Tolucci, you'll have me married off in less than a week. Brian's referred to the same Ben Vargas Mrs. Tolucci did. Ben had just recently taken over the local garage from his dad, who decided to retire. These days, Ben was deferential to the point of shyness. Brian had been teasing his dad for weeks. At times, Paul thought he caught hints of interest in Ben's eyes. Whenever Paul entered the store, the owner made sure he waited on him. And to be perfectly honest, Paul had to admit he tried to go there at times. He knew Ben was working. Since their cars were old, especially the beater they were fixing up now, that Brian turned 16, they needed parts quite often. Just be home in time to pick up your brother, Paul said. John Chester's bar sat on Lower Wacker Drive, where it would have met Madison Street if it had been Upper Wacker Drive. Paul parked his car in the dimness and strolled to the door. John Chester's was one of the most popular cop bars in the city. The sinister depths created by shadows and the darkness of the nearby river held little fear for patrons. The bar's reputation kept possible problems in other parts of the city. John Chester kept the outside immaculately clean. The sidewalk swept the picture window, washed at least once a day on the outside. The room opened out to the left. Rare patrons complained about the dark gloominess of the interior until they glimpsed the mural painted over the left-hand wall from the front all the way to the back. It looked like an Italian Baroque nightmare. Cherubs and praying nuns abounded on hills and fields amid enough animals to shock half the zoos in the world. More than one drunk had added splashes of color to corners and crevices of the painting so that parts had faded erratically. Those in the know ignored the decor and watched the patrons. If they observed carefully, they would see a procession of local, state, and national politicians. One might stop first in the Chicago mayor's office to get an endorsement, but one always stopped at John Chester's in the hope Chester would give his nod of approval. Years ago, he'd been elected alderman in a huge landslide, and then quit 4 years later to open the bar, one of the few proverbially honest politicians in the city. He quit to keep his integrity. Most candidates walked away from his bar unendorsed and disappointed. The few upon whom he conferred approval cherished the moment. John Chester hadn't backed a loser in 15 years. Paul leaned back in his chair and enjoyed the air-conditioned murk. His head rested against the wall behind him. The front two legs of his chair hovered 3 inches off the floor. He watched Ian Hume stride through the front door of Chester's bar. Exterior light briefly lit up the gloom. Ian didn't look to the back where Paul sat. John Chester had Ian's draft Heineken, half poured, before the reporter perched on a bar stool. They exchanged pleasantries about the value of air conditioning until Ian spotted Turner and walked over. Ian turned a chair around and straddled it, leaning his elbows on the top edges and taking several long, satisfying drinks from his stein. Ian Hume was the star reporter for the city's major gay newspaper, the Gay Tribune. 2 years ago, he'd won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism for his expose of the medical establishment's price-fixing of AIDS drugs. Turner and Hume had gone through the police academy together and had been assigned the same district as beat cops. They'd come to respect and like each other, but Ian had gotten fed up with the system and, in addition, made the decision to come out sexually. He'd gone back to school for his journalism degree and begun writing newspaper articles. Then he'd quit the department to work full-time as a reporter for the local gay newspaper. Ian had been a great help to Paul in the emotionally difficult time after his wife's death. When Jeff was born, they had been lovers for 3 years and close friends since their breakup. Occasionally, they had been of some help to each other. On cases, sometimes, the sharing of information proved very helpful. Ian belched obnoxiously and slammed his stein down on the table. He glared at John Chester. Turner watched the tall, broad-shouldered owner unhurriedly bring over a refill. He plunked the beer down, gave Ian a good-natured pat on the shoulder, and returned to his post behind the bar. "A bad day?" Paul asked. Ian shifted his 6'6" frame so that his legs rested on a chair at the next table. He scratched his blonde beard with both hands, flipped the slouch fedora he always wore into the middle of the table. "Everything is fucking nuts at the paper. Nobody knows how to handle this murder today. We hate Mucklegrass so much, and it's great to see him miserable, but to kill somebody's kid, you've got to totally be nuts. I want to see the man chained, tortured, and exiled to another planet, simply because he's such an ignorant fuck. Add his anti-gay stuff, and I think he should be shot. Whoever offed him would be doing all of us a big favor." "But you don't kill his kid." Ian shook his head. "I drew the line at that kind of shit. I gotta be among the first on my block to hear the press release." Turner described the scene in the suite. "I attended the press conference," Ian said. "It was more the same shit. I can't wait for the day when a politician getting elected by bashing gays goes completely out of date. It worked for him once. It won't again, I hope. He's got united opposition in California this time." Ian took a long swallow of beer. "So, you got the case. Figures. You're good at this shit. It's got to be somebody getting revenge on the old bastard." "You think so? Don't you? I heard a radio report that the killer said, 'Sorry now, aren't you?' Then killed her. That sounds like vengeance to me." Turner shrugged. "The man had a lot of enemies. You could line up every liberal and minority group member in the country and have a hard time narrowing down the list of suspects." Ian sipped from his stein for a minute, then said, "You know, this isn't the first sorry now incident." "Uh-huh," Turner said. Ian drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, "Yep, it was in the Tribune, maybe even the Sun-Times. A notoriously homophobic legislator from Kankakee, a woman who opposed every gay rights bill, every AIDS funding bill, every woman's rights bill. She looks like a pig-faced cow." "That sounds prejudiced," Turner said. "I don't care. She voted against anything that might have benefited gay people in the remotest way." "And probably every bill for every other minority," Paul said. "Maybe so, but the point is the sorry now shit." Ian explained that the woman was inordinately proud of owning the oldest mansion in Kankakee, and that it had been in her family for nearly a century. Somebody torched it while she and her husband were on vacation. They lost everything. Priceless antiques, family heirlooms from England, brought over before the American Revolution. They lost irreplaceable millions. Painted in bright yellow letters on the driveway was the message. Sorry now, aren't you? Maybe I'll give Kankakee a call, Turner said. They had few other leads. He'd give it a try. The sound level on the large screen TV over the bar rose. They looked over. John Chester had turned on the Mucklerath religious cable TV station. They were broadcasting live from Soldier Field. The Reverend was still talking about the murder. Tears streamed down his face as he described the scene that morning. Paul began to say something to Ian, but the reporter held up his hand. Wait, I want to hear this. Paul listened on the screen. The tears stopped. Minutes later, the Reverend Mucklerath was into full fury. Spectacular rages and mighty diatribes were the warp and woof of his religious tapestry. Now he was after the Chicago police for not doing enough, for not assigning enough men, for not returning his phone calls. His voice rose to a screech as he called down God's wrath on those who failed in the investigation. Turn that shit down, Ian bellowed. John shook his head at the television set and slowly complied. Ian grinned at Paul. Well, you're in deep shit. The good Reverend will have your ass in hell if you screw this up. It'll be a proper investigation, no matter if God intervened or not, Paul said. Ian took several healthy gulps from his stein of beer. You set for tomorrow night? He asked. Paul sighed. I rented the goddamn tux. I haven't won one since I went to the prom with Sheila Frazzini 18 years ago. Sheila Frazzini? She married a rich Italian baker's son, who is now, I believe, selling real estate in Hawaii or Nome or someplace. You'll have a good time tomorrow night. I've never gone to a bachelor auction cruise on Lake Michigan. Half the do-good groups in the city had discovered the benefit of having fundraisers while cruising on Lake Michigan. Turner took a gulp of beer and continued. You, my son, and Mrs. Tolucci all want me to get married. Who did your son notice? A guy at the local auto parts store. How butch? I'm only going tomorrow night because it's a good cause. John switched the TV over the bar to the 9 o'clock news. They watched the lead item, various reports on the death of Christina Mucklerath, with extensive coverage of the Reverend's speech at Soldier Field. Bastard, Ian said. He tipped his beer stein upside down, so John would see he needed more. Paul still nursed his first one. You know, Ian said, he isn't the only anti-gay bastard who's gotten it lately. Paul raised an inquisitive eyebrow. You heard what happened at the dinner for Veronica Belushka? A lot of people got sick, something like that. That's how the Sun-Times and Tribune reported it, but as an A-star reporter, I know what really happened, just as I know anything and everything there is to know about the gay community in Chicago. Turner ignored the boast and asked, Are we talking murder here? Nothing that dramatic. There was a brief item alluding to it in the gay papers. Did you see it? No, I rarely pick up the gay papers. I've barely got the time to look at any newspaper. Plus, you don't deliver, Ian sighed. I write brilliant news stories, witty columns, biting editorials, and wickedly funny movie reviews, and you never see them. Did you want to tell me about Mrs. America or not? Ian said. You remember the woman, young, beautiful, curvaceous, aren't they all? I suppose so. You did hear she resigned. Yeah, the guys talked about it like Vanessa, what's her name, years ago. Right. The current Miss America, Veronica Belushka, had started a series of speaking tours in which she attacked gay people. The controllers of the pageant, wishing to keep their winner non-political, insisted she stop. She wouldn't. She denounced them as closeted gays, either voluntarily or having been forced to do so. She'd resigned a month ago, and then began her latest tour, at times outdrawing the Reverend Mucklerath. Like you said, the newspapers reported that a lot of people got sick at a fundraising dinner she hosted. I happen to know that people didn't get sick. Ian laughed. They all got the runs. Huh? Paul said. Diarrhea, the shits, Ian said. I didn't need a more graphic explanation. What I meant was, how does this connect with being anti-gay? Rumor had it Fuck 'em was involved, Ian said. Fuck 'em was a radical gay organization fed up with the inability of other gay groups to change the world quickly enough to suit them. Turner knew they had a branch in Chicago. He also knew the acronym stood for nothing except the group's in-your-face attitude. Ian took a swallow of his recently refilled beer and continued, I tracked down the rumor to my usually impeccable sources. I can't prove it, but I'm sure it wasn't the food they served that caused the problem. I think one of the members of Fuckum got into the kitchen and put something into the food and gave them all the runs. Ian laughed. You didn't put that in the paper, Paul said. Nope, I couldn't prove it. It happened out in one of the suburbs. Schaumburg, I think. You should call the cops out there, see what they say. I can't imagine there being a connection, Turner said. Or are you trying to say there's an international gay organization called the Queer Avengers? Righting wrongs, protecting the weak, and doing good? Make fun. It was exceptionally well planned. Only a limited number of people had access to the kitchen. No one claimed to see anything unusual. They haven't got a clue, certainly not a suspect. Normally, murderers or any type of serial killers don't branch out to other crimes. Some kind of pattern develops. There's no connecting method here, Turner said. Besides, she must have lots of other enemies. We aren't the only ones who get singled out for attack by ignorant bigots. Do you have any clues in this one? Ian asked. Right now, it's the usual routine police work. Nothing promising at the moment. They ordered another round of beers. Paul tiptoed into Jeff's bedroom. It was after 1. Brian had picked Jeff up from Mrs. Tolucci's when he got home. As Paul knew he would, he felt very lucky to have a son like Brian. He cared so much for his less able brother. Paul Turner had the normal anxieties any parent would about his teenage son. Did he try drugs? Would he be able to resist the peer pressure to do stupid things? Would he get drunk one night and end up smashed to pieces on an expressway? Was he trying sex? Was he being careful? Paul remembered the conversation he'd had with Brian about condoms 2 years ago. Brian had been fairly amused, had simply told his dad he knew what they were and knew where to get them, if and when he ever needed them. Paul stayed out of his son's bedroom. He didn't want to know if there were porno magazines stashed in the bottom of the closet or condoms in the dresser drawer. When guests visited, he closed the door. Jeff lay in bed peacefully. Light from the street below drifted through the boy's window. From it, Paul could see the scar revealed by the covers gathered below his son's back. He sighed wistfully. He'd never gotten over the stage of knowing if he had all the magic power in the universe. The first thing he would do was touch his son's back and cure him. He thought of Christina and then imagined anyone trying to hurt either of his sons. He knew he'd never let that happen. He sat on Jeff's bed with the back of his hand. He caressed the soft skin of his sleeping son's face. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.